Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Like most of you, I've been shaken by the events surrounding Charlie Kirk's assassination. Everyone seems to be offering their perspective on what it means and how they feel about it. And that's good. That's what we should do as Americans. We should use our free speech to sort out what matters and what these events mean. So, I'll do the same. I'll think out loud with you about how this infamous event has made me reflect on my own life and on our particular moment in history. I've always been endlessly fascinated by how human beings have come to know so much about the world. How did we figure out what was true? How did we determine what was good? Growing up outside of any organized religion, I didn't inherit a ready-made moral or metaphysical framework. So, I gravitated toward the history of science. I wanted to understand how we built the machines that gave us such power, how we uncovered the hidden workings of the universe, how we amassed this astonishing capacity for knowledge. As I immersed myself in the field, I began to realize that much of the history of science was told as a history of rebellion. The great discoveries were framed as victories over authoritarian dogma, especially the dogma of Christianity. Copernicus and Galileo challenging a geocentric universe, Darwin overturning creationism, Enlightenment thinkers defying the church with new visions of reason and rights. The arc of science, as I first encountered it, was cast as a drama of liberation, humanity throwing off the chains of religion to discover objective truth about nature and ourselves. That was the story I absorbed in college, and it's the story that carried me to Stanford for graduate school, where I spent 7 additional years researching the history of science and technology more deeply. It was exhilarating at first to see how centuries of thinkers had chipped away at superstition and authority to uncover the truth of reality. Yet, the deeper I went into academia, the more I discovered that the story of science was being framed not simply as rebellion against error, but, ironically, as a wholesale rejection of truth itself. Many of the most fashionable scholars in the humanities and social sciences were carried away with insisting that every claim was relative, every paradigm destined to be replaced, every judgment a mask for power. I learned firsthand that the one thing you were never permitted to say as a graduate student in history was that something was objectively true, or good, or beautiful. But this seemed self-defeating and self-evidently wrong. So I started to push back. In several of my graduate school seminars, I found myself sliding into heated debates with professors about the existence of objective categories. For example, one professor insisted that my assertion that science was indeed moving closer to truth demonstrated that I was falling into the trap of teleology. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, meaning end or purpose. And in academic jargon, it refers to the assumption that history or science is inevitably moving towards some fixed goal. To say that science is progressing toward truth, in my professor's view, was to imagine that knowledge itself has some preordained destination, which I was supposed to reject as a professional historian in training. For example, if you say the history of physics was always meant to culminate in something like Einstein's theory of relativity, or that someone was destined to discover evolution like Darwin did, that would be considered a teleological reading of the history of science, as though nature had some built-in script just waiting to be uncovered. My professor insisted that was an illusion and that each scientific theory simply reflected a particular culture's values. It might dominate for a time, but another scientific theory would take its place, and then another, with no final truth on the horizon. I objected, arguing that the history of science clearly showed there are right and wrong answers to how the world works, and the whole point of science is to gain clarity about why wrong answers are wrong and why right answers are right. We aren't just shifting paradigms around like fashion trends. We are moving away from falsehood and toward truth. After all, Newton's equations helped us land a man on the moon and bring him home alive. Darwin's theory of evolution has been vindicated again and again, from the fossil record lining up with his predictions to the discovery of DNA, which revealed the mechanism of inheritance and descent he inferred. Einstein's predictions about relativity were confirmed by satellites whose clocks actually deviated as he said they would. So, these aren't just shifting narratives. They are scientific theories that actually map onto reality, tested by prediction and confirmed by evidence. Still, the reigning mood in academia that I encountered again and again was to act as if we knew nothing, as if science itself were just another language game, even as we relied on its predictive power to live our lives. I never knew how to reconcile that schizophrenia, except to see it as a fashion, a nihilistic, self-destructive, corrosive one, a posture of doubt that mocked the very purpose of the university, which is explicitly to search for truth. All I could really deduce from this was a handful of unsatisfying possibilities. Maybe even my professors didn't fully understand the implications of what they were arguing. Or maybe they did and simply enjoyed the game of endlessly problematizing, spinning out contradictions for the sake of scholarly activity. Perhaps their skepticism had grown so totalizing that they really were willing to say that we can never know anything about anything, that maybe we're living inside some kind of divine computer simulation, and all of our science is nothing but the clever math of a cosmic video game. Or maybe the whole enterprise was less profound than that. Maybe it was simply the decadence of a field running out of useful things to say. If you can't generate fresh insight, you can at least generate complexity, something esoteric enough to escape the scrutiny of common sense. And this wasn't just confined to the field of history. Like a cancer, this academic fashion had spread throughout the humanities and social sciences. A fundamental part of that fashion was linguistic. When an academic argument grew thin, the prose grew thick. Vague abstractions and endlessly proliferating qualifiers did the work that evidence should have done. If you kept everything sufficiently problematized, no claim ever had to be tested against reality, and no scholar ever had to be pinned down to a clear position. It was a clever immunity to accountability, masquerading as sophistication. Whatever the motive, the effect was predictable. Lots of undergraduates sat through these lectures confused, went through the motions on exams, and then moved on and forgot it all. And for decades, society could afford that indulgence. In an era of ever-expanding prosperity, we could get away with tolerating a class of intellectuals spinning vapid, self-contradictory theories with no apparent consequences. But of course, the indulgence was not harmless. It planted the seeds of incoherence, cynicism, and self-destruction that have since sprouted throughout our wider culture. Over the years, then decades, the radical skepticism I saw in graduate school had metastasized into something much larger, a generational suspicion of the entire Western inheritance, not just of science, but of art, law, of politics, of morality itself. The West had once staked its identity on the pursuit of objective truth, goodness, and beauty. From the Renaissance celebration of form and harmony, where artists pursued ideal proportion, symmetry, and lifelike motion, to the Enlightenment struggle for justice and rights, to the liberal institutions of common law, rational inquiry, and free expression, the civilization we inherited had been uniquely committed to grafting the spirit of science, its demand for evidence, its insistence on objectivity and coherence, onto every branch of public life. What did form and harmony mean in practice, for example? Think of Michelangelo's David, his balanced stance and musculature, his intelligent gaze conveying patient calculation, the human frame rendered at peak capability, strength combined with reason. Or remember Madonna and Child. tenderness, protection, new life. These Renaissance images endure because they capture realities about human nature and especially human flourishing, not because some elite decreed them beautiful. The proportion that makes a bridge stand is akin to the proportion that makes a statue noble, form aligned to function, truth rendered in art and construction. That's why beauty can be objective, because it corresponds to what allows creation to thrive. By the same token, objective goodness is what reliably reduces suffering and expands human flourishing. A just trial that acquits the innocent and convicts the guilty is objectively better than a show trial. Clean water and sanitation that prevent cholera are objectively better than contaminated wells. A policy that protects children from predation and families from random violence is objectively better than one that doesn't. We know these things the same way we know a solid beam from a rotten one about to collapse. Enlightenment figures like Hume and Condorcet, Jefferson and Madison tried to implement these kinds of insights by turning the methods of rational inquiry into the methods of moral progress and good governance. They sought to leverage rational thought to overcome the lies and evils of practically all past societies: slavery, disenfranchisement, the repression of women, and the exploitation of children, by appealing to standards beyond mere power, the standards of reason. But the very project of appealing to objective standards was precisely what a growing number of college-educated citizens were trained to reject. By the late 20th century and accelerating into the 21st, generations of college students had been taught that there were no objective truths, no universal standards of beauty, no moral categories of good and evil. And so the West's long pursuit of these things was recast as a fraud. It wasn't a quest for liberation, they were told. It was a clever mask for domination. From this vantage point, all the West's achievements were suspect. The Renaissance's celebration of beauty, an exclusionary ideal imposed by elites. The Enlightenment's claim to reason and universal rights, a smokescreen for white male privilege. The liberal order's common law and standards of evidence, merely the instruments of those already in power to secure their dominance. And because the West had in fact used the tools of reason to generate unprecedented wealth, unmatched military strength, and enormous global influence, those very successes were taken as proof of the West's guilt. This reframing spread directly into politics and mainstream media. As more and more college-educated citizens adopted this worldview, they coalesced disproportionately around the Democratic Party, reshaping it from within. Where the party had once grounded itself in appeals to fairness, equal opportunity, and civic duty, its base now increasingly spoke the language of cultural relativism, power analysis, and suspicion of the West's inheritance. By the early 21st century, the Democratic Party had become the political expression of this academic catechism, the conviction that Western civilization itself was not a story of progress, but of lies and oppression. By the time of Donald Trump's first presidential term, the paradox had come into full view. The most highly educated citizens of the West, those who had benefited the most from the West's legacy of objectivity through their access to higher education, had also become the most convinced that this legacy was evil. What politically conservative and culturally religious Americans still defended as the Judeo-Christian and Enlightenment inheritance of truth, goodness, and beauty was now dismissed by educated liberals as ignorance at best and tyranny at worst. And here's where that paradox blew up. The very voices insisting that there was no such thing as objective truth, goodness, or beauty, that all claims to universality are nothing more than veils for power, turned around and declared with certainty that Republicans, and especially anyone who voted for Donald Trump, were evil. Not just wrong, evil. Think about that contradiction. On one hand, truth is relative, morality is subjective, beauty is whatever I say it is, and the West's claims to objectivity are just a mask for domination. On the other hand, when a figure like Donald Trump comes along, embodying the West's unapologetic confidence in objective truth and strength, the relativists start screaming in absolutes. Suddenly, they rediscover categories of good and evil. Suddenly, they insist that to defend the West's legacy is not just wrong, but categorically, objectively indefensible. And so, the white male avatar of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, became the perfect foil. He was portrayed as the living embodiment of everything rotten about Western civilization. And in condemning him, the left revealed the double standard at the heart of its creed. No truth, except the truth that their enemies are fascists. No good, except the good of dismantling the West. No beauty, except whatever flatters an ever-shifting sense of self that must be affirmed with absolute certainty on demand. Question any of these things, and you're not merely mistaken, you are evil, and your words are violence. This is what is so deeply hypocritical about the modern left. It is precisely because the left has become so categorical in its morals, after lecturing the rest of us not to be for generations, that their indictments of Trump in particular and conservatives in general reframes disagreement as hate. And once you accept that disagreement is hate, it's a short jump to accepting that words are violence. And once you accept that, the conclusion follows with chilling speed. If ideas you don't like are a form of violence, then responding against those ideas with violence becomes justified. And if the people espousing those ideas are Nazis, then harming those people becomes righteous. This is the poisoned logic that has been incubated for decades, and Charlie Kirk's assassination was the most predictable fruit of it. Charlie was shot for speaking words his assassin had been conditioned to believe were a form of absolute evil. But Charlie's crime was nothing more than fulfilling the most important ideal of Western civilization: to reason openly, to seek truth in public. He went where the hostility was hottest, onto college campuses, because he believed that ideas should be tested in debate, not silenced with force. He knew the risks, he knew the culture had been primed to see disagreement as hate, and he still showed up. Again and again, he put his life on the line to defend America's First Amendment principle that speech is how free people pursue what is true and good. His death is not an isolated spasm of madness. It is the natural consequence of a worldview that denies objective truth, objective goodness, and objective beauty until the moment it needs those categories as weapons against its enemies. Anyone with eyes to see could have known this was coming. And Charlie Kirk knew it, but he bore the risks anyway. And here's the part that millions of ordinary Americans cannot unsee: the way their own neighbors reacted. People who had never even heard of Charlie Kirk before watched the video of his assassination and grieved instinctively. They knew in their bones that what had happened to him was a tragedy. Their hearts broke for his wife, his two little kids, his parents, and they also understood why Charlie's murder meant something even darker about America than Irina Zarutska's murder on the bus in Charlotte only a couple days earlier. And in that moment of shock, when so many Americans desperately scrolled their social media feeds to learn more and to weep along with their fellow Americans over the irreversible destruction of something sacred, what they saw instead was almost as horrifying. They saw coworkers, teachers, classmates, government employees, and countless others not condemning the violence, but justifying it, even celebrating it. And that was the moment, for millions of Americans, when the abstract idea of a culture war became visceral. It was no longer just about the divisive rhetoric on CNN, MSNBC, TikTok, X. It was about who you shared your city with, who was shaping your kids' classrooms, who was staffing your local hospital. This is where the sleeping giant of moderate, middle of the road America suddenly awoke. They had seen a young woman like Irina Zarutska stabbed in the neck by a man who should have been behind bars. And then only 2 days later, they saw a charismatic family man like Charlie Kirk shot in the neck for daring to stand up for traditional American values. And that is when millions of Americans knew that there really is objective truth and goodness and beauty worth defending in this world, because that's when they saw and felt through their awakened rage and despair that evil and lies and ugliness had been systematically encouraged to thrive in this country. That's when I knew, as an individual who had never believed in God, that the West was in a spiritual fight for its life. That's when I knew, as someone who had spent decades studying the history of science as a means to understand how humanity can determine what is true, what is good, what is beautiful in the absence of religion, that Judeo-Christian wisdom was the moral bedrock on which I would stand shoulder to shoulder with every other common sense American, ready to declare that enough was enough. And that was a moment of clarity more enlightening than anything I had ever experienced before. I realized that even as an agnostic, non-religious, science enthusiast academic, when I beheld real evil, I still instinctively reached for the traditional Judeo-Christian principles in the DNA of Western civilization. And I was not alone. Millions of Americans who had drifted from faith or who had never been particularly religious to begin with, like me, had clearly felt the same thing. And it is causing a political and cultural earthquake like nothing we have ever seen. We are about to witness the most conservative and Christian generation in a century flood into American politics. That's one of the things that Charlie Kirk's martyrdom means. Tolerance has been the West's greatest strength, but it's also our most dangerous weakness. As I've discussed on the show before, Alan Bloom captured this best in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, warning us decades ago that in becoming open-minded to every idea, Americans had abandoned the search for the best ideas. But as millions of Americans have now definitively realized, tolerance without limits is civilizational suicide. So here is where we must begin drawing lines. Here is where we must recover the courage to be intolerant. Intolerant of evil, of lies, of ugliness masquerading as virtue. We must become intolerant of the claim that America is nothing but a white supremacist empire. We must become intolerant of the monstrous lie that millions of children, not a rare few with genuine dysphoria, but children en masse, are born into the wrong body and must be affirmed in that socially contagious delusion. We must become intolerant of the perverse compassion for criminals and thugs at the direct expense of civilized people. We must become intolerant of the absurd notion that standards of excellence, whether in math, merit, punctuality, or discipline, are racist. We must become intolerant of the profound historical ignorance of the claim that the West is uniquely evil. We must become intolerant of the madness that identity outranks character, or that moral authority depends on skin color. And we must never again tolerate the gaslighting that tries to convince us that disagreement is violence, and that affirming what we know to be false is our moral obligation. What first drew me to the history of science was that it was a history of rebellion, of men and women who refused to bow to the authoritarian dogmas of their age. That rebellion is what gave birth to modern science, modern freedom, and the modern West. And now, in our own time, the dogma has simply changed its disguise. Whether you call it wokeism, identity politics, or the cult of relativism, it is no less authoritarian. And if the West is to endure, we must find that spirit of rebellion again. For far too long, we've let a style of academic obfuscation bleed into our public and political life, and to entirely infect the mainstream media. It's the habit among politicians and political pundits of making ideas so abstract, so buried in newly minted jargon, that they escape the scrutiny of common sense. In the classroom, professors got away with this for decades by hiding behind their credentials. If you couldn't follow their arguments, the assumption was that you weren't smart enough, when in truth, it was often because the argument itself was incoherent. We can't tolerate that anymore. The responsibility should always be on the person making the claim to make it clear enough for practically anyone to understand. And more than that, to prove it against reality. That was always the strength of science. The theories of scientific revolutionaries, though blasphemous in their day, actually did map onto the world in a way that everyone could experience for themselves. And so, today, when people claim, for example, that America is nothing but white supremacy, or that speech is violence, or that dissenting from trans ideology is literally harming people, we must demand the same standard. Make them map their theories onto reality. Demand specific cause and effect evidence. And if they're flustered or can't summon specifics, then they are no longer allowed to problematize others for not understanding their abstractions. For America to remain the one society in history where the entire country is a safe space for anyone to seek objective truth, goodness, and beauty, in public, out loud, whether at a campus rally or in a conversation at a dinner party, the majority of us must finally have the courage and the conviction and the sense of strength in numbers to call it like we see it when we encounter a bad idea. We don't need to be rude, and we certainly should never be violent, but we must stop being so deferential and just say, I disagree. Here's what I think. Prove me wrong. I'm Brad Harris. So long.